Good morning.
Good morning.
It is October 9th, 2014. I am Misty Luminais. I'm here interviewing LaVora Perry, who is a community researcher with the Voicing in Action project. So we're going to start out really broad. Can you tell me about your experiences with the Voicing in Action project?
Well, that is very broad. What is it that you're looking for?
Like when you tell other people about what you do, what is it that you tell them?
That I interview residents or stakeholders in East Cleveland about their experiences in East Cleveland, including their history, their memories, and what they think about the city, and how they like the city to be, that kind of thing.
And has it been enjoyable?
Yeah, I've enjoyed doing it. I've learned a lot that I wouldn't have known otherwise because I'm not from East Cleveland originally. So I've been able to interview people who were here, when I wasn't. A common theme amongst those people is how much the city's changed, and kind of a longing for it to return to that or to become better than it is now.
So aside from interviewing, how else have you participated in the project?
Well, I had to get trained to be able to do the interviewing. So I learned, that was a learning process in itself, how to be a live, what do you call it, a human subject researcher, and what goes into that process, and how that process was, the history behind how that evolved to what it is today, at least at CASE, and also, I guess, nationally, what sort of, what the rules are, the criteria for doing that.
Mm-hmm.
So that was interesting.
And then the monthly meetings?
Yeah, well, I haven't been to all of the monthly meetings, but the ones that I do go to, it's always good to hear from the other participants and what their experiences have been, and also to get ideas for how to conduct interviews going forward.
And you're in the unique position where you've been working with your children. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it has been challenging at some points. My daughter's older, and sometimes, and especially in the beginning, there was some tension in terms of just deciding who was going to do what. So then I had to really kind of set some ground rules regarding that specifically, if I got the interview, then I'm going to be the leader on that interview. So that was clear from the onset. So it helped I wouldn't have gotten to that place had we not had the issues in the beginning. So I wouldn't have known that was necessary to kind of lay that down. And it probably would have been different definitely, working with anybody different is a different experience. So that was with my daughter. With my son, things were easier only because he definitely did not want to be the leader. He just wanted to stay on camera. And so I would have to actually ask him, do you have any questions? And he usually did not. But he did lead one interview, he seemed to have enjoyed it. I wish he could be interviewed, but he's not old enough. But that was his friend. And so that brought another level because we hadn't interviewed anybody as young as his friend was.
And how did you find recruiting people to interview?
It was challenging, but as long as I persisted, I always found somebody who would agree to do it. So it's just a matter of, going out and looking for people. There were times when people didn't want to do it. One time somebody said they didn't want to do it and changed their minds. So then the reverse has happened. People said they would do it and change their minds. But as long as I kept looking, I would always find new people.
Mm-hmm. So how has your perception of the community changed due to your involvement with the project, aside from just learning more about the history?
I think through the process I gained a deeper understanding of how so many people really, at least the people I interviewed, I know there are people who don't feel this way, but a lot of people have a lot of pride in East Cleveland and really, even though they don't live here anymore, are nostalgic about how they grew up and the East Cleveland they used to know, and really have a deep desire to see the city rebound. So that's what I gained, is just a knowledge of this kind of real love for the city that exists.
And I know you've been an activist for a while. Did this make you feel more connected to kind of activism in East Cleveland?
Yeah, I would not. Certainly when I started this, I would not have described myself as an activist. I don't know that I would even describe myself as an activist now, but it did, I think the process did kind of, like I said, tap into this a deep appreciation, and again, I'm repeating myself, but this love for the city, which I already had myself, even though I'm not in even though I didn't grow up in East Cleveland. I've been here for 22 years, going on 20, it'll be 22 years in November. But I immediately fell in love with the city. So to find these people who have been here in the 60s, in the 70s, sometimes even longer than that, elderly people, who had this feeling. It was good to know that there's this this camaraderie that exists amongst those people. And again, I don't think any of the people I interviewed felt this way, but I know there are people who don't feel that way, who want to get well, the people I talked to, some of them have left, but they still have this feeling. But there are people who do not have that feeling. They don't want to be here. They don't like the city. But those weren't the people that I interviewed for this project.
And so you are the editor of the East Cleveland Narrator.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about whether or not the Voicing in Action project influenced that project that you do now? Yes, it did. I am the publisher and the editor, so which I just say that because I actually produced the paper and I also edit it. But yeah, the Voicing in Action project didn't start me on the paper. That was something. There was another incident that was kind of the catalyst for me doing that. But what did happen was sometimes during interviews there were other questions I wanted to pursue. I would be like, oh, I'm going to come back and interview this person, because I worked for a different newspaper, and I never, which was the Neighborhood Voice newspaper. That ended in December of 2013, and then I started my paper in May of 2014. So not very long afterwards. But there were people who I had in the back of my mind, like, oh, I want to come back and interview them for the paper. But I never got a chance to do that. So so this to me is like an extension of that aspect of the Voicing in Action project, just being able to go at people in a little different way and get information that may not have been relevant to this project, but that I was interested in. And can you talk about how you chose the name East Cleveland Narrator?
Yeah, that was that's another thing that came out of this project. There was I don't know the exact quote, you probably do, but something along the lines of, whoever tells the story. I had heard this before. It's not like I just heard it through this project, but this was one of the foundational pieces of this project, was just having the community, hearing community voices. So the quote is something along the lines of whoever controls the narrative controls history, or something like that. And I really wanted this paper for East Clevelanders to tell their own story, because we've been talked about so much in the media, and other people have projected their ideas of who East Clevelanders are onto our city without asking us who we are. So that's where I got the idea of the narrator, that the narrator is us. They're, telling our own stories.
Awesome. So what skills have you learned?
I think I've honed my interviewing skills. Um, and that would be the biggest thing, and going back and getting deeper responses to questions. So, yeah. There were a couple of times when I had to re-interview, go and just to get more in depth, or answer. Sometimes I skipped questions altogether, so I had to go back and do that. So that was helpful, just, always knowing that I could do that.
And what about camera skills?
That's Jared.
So you don't feel like you really learned the camera that well?
Not very well. Not that camera.
Okay. And what about different ways to engage the community? Did you?
What do you mean by that?
Well, I know you were at a couple of our library events,
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know, like in between going out and getting interviews with people you might not have talked to otherwise,
Mm-hmm.
and then helping us with the library events, like were there any skills that you refined by engaging with community like that?
If there were, honestly, I can't think of what they were.
And what about your analytical skills? Do you feel like going to the monthly meetings has helped you think about things differently?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Just hearing other people's perspectives and their experiences in the interviews gave me ideas on how to do things, and how to, and also enabled me to look at my own interviewing process in different ways than I might have otherwise.
But were you able to think about people's individual experiences and connect them to larger structures? Like we spent a lot of time talking about kind of structural racism. Were you able to start seeing in your interviews when people would talk about individual experiences, how that connected to greater structures?
Yeah, but I think that a lot of that I brought to it anyway, because I already felt like that existed. So sometimes in my interviews, when people would say something that kind of disconnected from the whole system, I might ask them a question that pointed back to systemic racism without saying that. Like, could there have been something else that impacted that? Or how did so-and-so, do you think so-and-so had an influence on, whatever happened to be, whatever they were talking about? And if it did, what would that influence have been? And that would usually bring people back around to other things. And then just specifically asking about racism. Rarely people would say, but it happened, that they didn't really have any experiences of racism. But then as they continue to talk, they begin to talk about those experiences.
And do you feel like you were able to share your understanding about systemic racism with the group of community researchers? Do you feel like you were able to add to that dialogue?
Possibly. I can't remember a certain point when I definitely did that, but I know we were all talking, so I wouldn't be surprised if that happened.
Okay. So we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about logistics. How do you prepare for interviews?
Well, Jared would get the camera together usually, and I would just make sure I had all the paperwork, really, and that confirm the time and the place and that kind of thing with the interviewee. And well, because everything was already scripted, I really didn't have to do a lot of preparation in terms of thinking of my own questions, because we already had questions.
So preparation wasn't a big, it just entailed making sure I had those papers. That was my biggest fear, that I didn't have them.
Did you do any further research? Like, you knew you were going to be interviewing, like Mr. Cap, for example. Did you do any background research, or did you refresh in your mind the things that you knew about his business before you interviewed him?
I did not. I wish I had, but I did not. And he's one that I would have liked. Well, I did interview him for my newspaper, because I would have liked to have done a different kind of interview than I did with him.
And what about the informed consent process?
I usually didn't hit a snag with that. The only time I did was with one individual who did not want his name to be given, so or his face. So so that was that. I mean, he did read over it, and that was where we hit a snag. So, but everybody else, there was no problem with it.
And how were you able, I know that, but can you explain how you were able to get that interview despite his hesitation?
We didn't film him. We filmed a bookcase. And then he went on to say his name, which I don't know how you all worked with that, but because he spoke his name. But yeah, that was it. Didn't want his name, didn't want his face.
Okay. And did you use the bio sheet?
Yes.
How was that?
It was fine. It was kind of tedious. And I think finally, you all decided that you didn't want that as part of the interview itself. So that kind of streamlined it a lot, because at that point I could give it to them and they could fill it out, and I didn't have to ask them those questions. And it went a lot faster.
On average, how long did your interviews last?
Anywhere from an hour to, I think one went over 2 hours.
So, how does the setting of the interview impact the work?
I didn't see a major difference in setting. The only thing that comes to mind is one interview took place in someone's home, and her mother was there, so her mother kind of interjected, I think, once during the interview, but that wasn't a problem. But otherwise, we've met primarily in the library, but also in people's homes, and Mr. Cap was at his business. So I never felt like the environment was a hindrance at all.
And since we can't interview your son because of age limitations, did he have any challenges, like as far as lighting or getting the camera set up?
A couple of times the mic wouldn't work, but he was able to figure out how to make it work. Well, I think one time he didn't figure it out, and we just used the internal mic. And that, I don't think that was him. I think that was with Nia.
So you probably did the most interviews in kind of a neutral setting in the library. Can you think whether there was any difference between, like, did it take people longer to open up in the library than it did in their homes, or vice versa?
Maybe, but I didn't really perceive it as that at the time. But looking back, perhaps. But they did open up.
I think that's one of your gifts. I think you do a really good job at getting people to open up. So,
thank you.
What has been the most surprising and or challenging aspect of the work?
Surprising and challenging?
Or?
Oh. I guess it's challenging to find people who will agree to do it. But again, as long as I keep asking different people, somebody agrees to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that, finding participants.
Mm-hmm. So you were able to participate a lot in the beginning, and then
Mm-hmm.
you've been able to participate a lot as we start wrapping things up.
Mm-hmm.
Did you find time challenges in the middle? Like what were your expectations of the time commitment that at the beginning, and then the actual time that was required, and how did you manage different priorities for yourself?
I really didn't have any expectations in terms of how much time it was going to take, except for knowing that it was going to take time to do the whole process for each interview. But I wasn't thinking, oh, this is going to take time out of my day or anything like that. And probably a lot of that is because I work for myself. If I had a job, then that probably would be more difficult to maneuver around my work schedule. Like I might only be able to do interviews. Well, most of the interviews were conducted on the weekend anyway, because the interviewees, that's when they were available. But I never felt pressured about that. Yeah.
And did you feel like it was easy to return to the work after you took some time off?
No, I stopped working because I was sick.
Mm-hmm.
So that just took me out for that period of time. But there was no, it wasn't hard to get back into it.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So how did what you actually do differ from what you thought you would be doing?
It didn't. We got pretty extensive training, so I knew what I mean, of course, I didn't know what every interview would be like, exactly, but I knew what I had signed up to do. So it really wasn't. There wasn't any surprises there.
So would you encourage others to participate?
Yeah, I think it's a good way to learn about the city, to learn about the people here, to connect to your neighbors. I think it builds community. The people I met, even though I haven't necessarily seen any of them, all of them since then, I think we got closer as a result of doing that because, they revealed there was a human connection. So it's a good way to connect to the people in our city on a deeper level than we might do otherwise.
So what advice do you have for future community researchers?
Practice on the camera, just in case you don't have somebody with you who can work it. Don't be like me. And really listen to the responses that you get, and I think that's, from my point of view, that's the key to having a really rich interview, is to be really interested in the person you're talking to, and that even if you're not interested at first, I think the interest comes with listening.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to shift gears a little more.
Mm-hmm.
How do you define social justice?
I Yes, social justice. Social justice is actively challenging injustices that affect society. And that's an ongoing process, because I think as soon as you stop doing that, new injustices arise. And this wasn't exactly your question, but I would say that, you know, the root of injustice, I think, is a deep disrespect for others, and along with that comes the protection of self-interest above all else, which I would define in one word as greed. And I think if we look at if we pursue the injustices that exist in society to their, you know, keep digging to where they come from, that yeah, they come from this disrespect, but they come from this level of greed. And, you know, being willing to just do away with everybody else's, you know, obliterate everybody else to get whatever it is that you think is important.
Has your definition changed because of this project?
I really didn't have a definition. I really didn't think about social justice. I didn't put those two words together before this project. Not that the ideas of this project were new to me. I just never had heard of the concept. I never heard of social justice before now, before you know, being introduced to the Social Justice Institute.
Do you want to pause it?
Unless you want me blowing my nose on camera. Okay.
So, can you explain what you've learned about social justice?
I've learned a lot about how it's. I've learned a lot about how it's dealt with in academia, and you know, the topic is dealt with in academia. It's interesting to see the different projects that the Social Justice Institute has, you know, come up with. Some in conjunction with NOAA, the Northern Ohio. What's NOAA stand for?
Northeast Ohio Alliance for Hope.
Right, right. So, yeah, I think, you know, seeing that there's university action around these issues has been interesting.
What issues specifically?
Systemic racism, which, you know, boils over into poverty and the, you know, poor education system, and those are two, you know, really fundamental problems. But also the lack of good food, which ties back into poverty. So, yeah.
Do you think this kind of project, the Voicing in Action project, is important or useful for social justice work?
Yeah, I think you can't have too much of any kind of work toward combating those problems that I just mentioned. But honestly, and I hate being on film saying this, but having seen this progression from the point of my lifetime to where we are right now, I think we're just really at a critical juncture. And I don't know
unless there's some really radical change that takes place, I don't see it. I don't see any way out of it, because so many people are. The problem's huge, and too few people are engaged in trying to address it, and a lot of people are oblivious to it. So, and this isn't positive at all, but yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what's going to have to happen before people wake up, and we're at a really serious, between the environment and which is huge, because without a sustainable without an environment that can sustain our lives, everything else doesn't matter. And we are fast, because of this whole greed thing, plummeting toward obliterating our environment's abilities to support human life. Earth will be here, but we won't unless something changes. And the people who could make those kind of changes on a global level are not interested in doing it, because they're only interested in profit. And the people that it's affecting, which is everybody else, there's only a small fraction of us that are trying to do something about it, and the rest of us are twerking. Sorry, that was my little morbid.
That's fine. So you said that we're at a critical juncture, that people aren't aware of the problem, that they're not paying attention to it. So aside from environmental degradation, is there some other problem or some other it that people aren't aware of? And are you talking about people like the human race, or are you talking about residents of East Cleveland?
Both. Yeah, I mentioned them. Our educational system, we've been totally dumbed down. And our children don't even know what, for the most part. I mean, there are exceptions. Kids who get to go to private schools, kids who get to go to some type of specialized public school. But most children are getting remnants of education. They're not, I mean, they can graduate. You go from, some are graduating without knowing how to read. Some are graduating without knowing basic history or geography. Not even knowing where to place themselves on a map. And we're letting that happen, graduate after graduate, which serves the whole greed thing. So education's one of those things. Poverty. We have a lot of poor people. We got people who are dependent on handouts, lack of good food. We give away, good food, once a month at Stephanie Tubbs Jones or, at some other food center, because we can't go every day in our neighborhood in East Cleveland and just go get fresh food unless we have a car, which, contributes to the whole environmental degradation thing. So, and then a lot of people just don't have a car. So they just don't have access to good food. I mean, we know this. This isn't new. So all these urban farms pop up. But that movement isn't big enough that it's really impacting the problem. The problem still exists.
Mm-hmm. And so how do you see projects like the Voicing in Action project impacting these problems?
I think it builds awareness. I think out of this project, hopefully, some people do become more active in combating these things. I think that probably happens. I don't know of anybody who's doing it, but I would imagine, if you expose enough people to these ideas, somebody's going to rise to the top and start being active around them. So I think that's always a good thing. The more people you can have kind of awaken to the problems and start addressing them, that's a good thing.
And what about at its most basic, like just the ability to tell your own story? Like, how do you think that impacts social justice?
Well, I think it's important to hear the voices of people who are on the ground. We get so much information coming at us from outside that it's definitely important to find out who our neighbors are and what their concerns are, what their thoughts are. So that's a good thing.
So after participating in the Voicing in Action project, do you feel more empowered?
I wouldn't say empowered, because I felt empowered previously, but I would say I feel more connected to the people in East Cleveland, because I've met more. I've actually met them and heard their stories and shared a little bit of mine, and so I would say that I feel more connected.
And so how do you feel like having a larger network has impacted your life?
In a positive way. Just again, the connectedness, not feeling less that I'm existing in my own like space, and feeling more a part of the greater community.
And how did you feel going to the library events, like when we were getting people to come out?
That was interesting. It was interesting. It was interesting to see the videos and what people said, because I hadn't, these were interviews that I mostly hadn't seen before. So, yeah.
So what impact do you think the Voicing in Action project has had on both the participants and the community at large?
I feel like I'm repeating myself, but I do think it's probably brought us together. So that we're not just, so we know who our neighbors are. I am repeating myself, but I think that's really big. And to know that people have some of the same concerns and aspirations as you have. And to also hear from people who don't. And so that some of the other perspectives that exist in the community that aren't different from yours.
So how do you feel like this has impacted the community researchers as a group?
I don't know the answer to that question, Misty, because I don't know. I would have to talk to everybody, and sorry.
That's fine.
I'm being a bad interviewee.
No, of course not. So how would you change or improve the project?
Well, I think I always did this anyway, and I don't know about and I would imagine the others did too, which was to ask questions that just came out of the questions that were there. But I think I would put in more space for that, and maybe, a question like, okay, here, interview, you can ask what other question do you have? Something along those lines. And then I think I talked to you. I'm big on open-ended questions. So I think phrasing the questions in same questions, but phrasing them in such a way that I wasn't, and I don't have the questions in front of me, but that I wasn't assuming that the participant had a certain point of view. Like, and this is an example, and I don't know, I doubt it that it's exactly worded this way. How has racism impacted you? The inference there is that the person believes that racism has impacted them. So, if it were me phrasing that question, it would be more like, do you think that racism? And I know that would result in a yes or no answer. Do you think would be a yes or no answer. But from there, I can ask why, which
opens up to, first of all, they have to think about why they said either yes or no, and we can go on from there. So that would be the biggest thing I would say is I prefer questions that don't assume a certain point of view of that the person being interviewed has a certain point of view.
I mean, working from the point of view that I think that most of us share as far as social justice goes.
Mm-hmm.
I think that most of us believe that race or racism has impacted all of us, regardless
mm-hmm.
of what our race is. So there are ways that racism has impacted me that I might not, prior to this work, that I might not have thought about the benefits that I get from white privilege,
mm-hmm.
But it is a way that racism impacts me.
Right.
So I think that I hear what you're saying, and I think it's a point that we want to think about.
Mm-hmm.
But I also don't think it's necessarily an invalid assumption that everyone has experienced racism in some way.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying it's not an invalid. I agree with you that everybody has.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm saying is the person being interviewed may not think so. And if I phrase the question as in how has it impacted you, that prevents me from hearing them say, it hasn't. Which allows me to say, well, why do you think it hasn't? It also allows me to begin to ask questions around that. Well, in such and such situation, what would you call that if you don't call it racism? It just opens up to a lot more based on what they said versus me putting their response into the container that I have.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And how did you feel about the feedback process?
Which process? Which feedback? At the table when we were all together, or one-on-one?
Both.
Mm-hmm.
Both the kind of the collective when we talked about other people's interviews and everyone had a chance to kind of talk about like what they would do differently or like logistics,
mm-hmm.
kind of as a group. And then I know the feedback process changed between when the project got initially started and then when I came on board.
Mm-hmm.
So we could talk about any of those three.
Sometimes the one-on-ones were hard, but that's only because I don't like being told what to do. So it wasn't really anything wrong with the process. It was just my own idiosyncrasy. And
what could I have done differently to make that easier? Would it have been easier if we sat down in person rather than did it over email?
I doubt it. I just don't like being told what to do. So you couldn't have done anything to, that's my own thing. So, and then the group thing was always helpful, It was always helpful to hear what other people had gone through and sometimes to hear their suggestions on how to do things, even if they weren't talking to me directly, but just, bouncing different experiences off the wall was helpful. That's why I clash with my daughter. I don't like being told what to do. She doesn't like being told to do. And I'm the mom. So
So, I know you said that there was another event that really caused you to start writing and publishing the narrator.
Mm-hmm.
But did you hear out of the interviews, like the call for a press for East Cleveland? I don't know if you were there, but like that's one of the, like when people talk about their vision for the city of East Cleveland,
Mm-hmm.
People repeatedly mention the fact that there was at the time no East Cleveland paper,
Mm-hmm.
and that people really wanted to see that. And I don't know if that was if that inspired you at all, or if that was something that you were aware of?
No, I hadn't heard that. And after I published the paper, I did hear people say, oh yeah, we used to have the East Cleveland Leader. And there was another paper, because somebody said, and we had another paper. So there were 2 other papers. I don't know the other one's name. But yeah, people have said that they've been glad to have a paper, and you know, I've seen it in the response of the community. But no, I didn't specifically hear that.
Okay, yeah, because it was just you started your paper, and I was like, yes, she's feeling like the people want this.
Good.
So, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I would like to say how I started the paper, just for the record.
Yeah. Go ahead.
There was the Cleveland Scene. He has a newspaper. The Cleveland Scene is a newspaper. It's an alternative newspaper. We have the 2 big papers we have 1 paper in Cleveland, the Cleveland Plain Dealer. The Scene is alternative. And one of the writers there, I knew him because he used to write for the paper that I worked for previously, the Neighborhood Voice. And he's a young person, and he wrote an article about a meeting he went to in East Cleveland back in March at the library. And he described the whole thing as if it were just a bunch of buffoons. And not at any point did he interview any of the people present. And that really disturbed me, because I felt like it was like he was a spectator watching a circus show. And I thought it was disrespectful to come into somebody else's environment, city, write about them, and when they were like, 3 feet away, not take the time to say, hey, I'm here from the scene. Why did you do thus and such? Why did you, and then to another person, why did you say thus and such? But instead to draw your own conclusions without talking to the people who were easy to talk to. They were right there. And so I wrote, and I should also back up and say prior to that, in November of 2013, an article appeared in the Cleveland Plain Dealer about how we should be taken over. We should merge with Cleveland because we're just something. The headline was like, we're sad, we're on our last leg or whatever, just pathetic. So I had written them a letter saying, stop with the East Cleveland bashing. So, fast forward to March again. So I called the Scene, I wrote a bunch of emails, I talked to the editor, I talked to the writer, and to the writer I was like, you're a young person. I'm old enough to be his mother. You should be setting a new tone. You should be on the vanguard of a new way of journalism instead of repeating this kind of crap that your predecessors did. This is done already. We've heard this narrative. And so they ended up doing a feature. The editor told me he was going to do a feature anyway on East Cleveland. And they put a big chunk of what I had written in the email in that. But still, it ended negatively. The whole thing ended negatively again. And I just felt like, I can write as many emails as I want. They're going to keep on doing this. And that's when I decided, I'll start my own paper. And that's really what happened.
Well, I know everyone in the community appreciates that it's there. There's a sense of pride and ownership in it that I hear from people in the city.
Oh, so. Good.
Yeah. Right. Anything else?
That's it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Can I show a picture? Since this is
Yes.
for the end. This is for posterity. So this is the latest edition of the East Cleveland Narrator.
All right. Hold it for 10 seconds. Okay. I just want to make sure that we got it. We needed still from it.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Misty.